A man will spend the next decade in prison after being found guilty of drug trafficking. A federal judge sentenced Nalush Johnson to 10 years in prison after he was convicted for selling drugs to an undercover federal agent 3 times in the same month. Johnson is also pending a first-degree murder charge now for shooting a man on Chestnut Street in Wilmington back in November of 2021.